So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about this war. Everyone is watching the missiles. Everyone is watching the battlefield maps shift week after week. Everyone is reading the diplomatic statements, the ceasefire rumors, the casualty numbers. The mainstream coverage is full of it. Who fired what? Which city was hit? Which leader made which speech? But almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people around the world. Not who is winning on the battlefield, not which alliance is stronger. The question that matters is this: what does this new phase of the war mean for your job, your food, your energy bill, your savings, your future? Because here is the answer. When you look at it carefully, this war is not just entering a new military phase. It is entering an economic phase, a phase that the world's governments, economists, and ordinary families have not even begun to prepare for. And depending on where you live, depending on which side of this economic shift your country falls on, your life is about to change in ways that most people cannot yet see coming. If you find this kind of analysis valuable, the kind that goes beyond the headlines and actually explains what is happening to your world, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us keep making this content. So today, I want to walk you through exactly what this new phase means, country by country, region by region, winner by winner, and loser by loser. So let us begin. Here's the first thing you need to understand, and it is the foundation for everything else I am going to tell you today. Every war has phases. The first phase of any modern conflict is the kinetic phase. The strikes, the counterstrikes, the territorial battles, the visible destruction. That is the phase that gets covered on every news channel every day, all day long. But major wars, wars that involve great powers, global supply chains, and contested resources always enter a second phase, a quieter phase. A phase the cameras do not capture well because it does not happen in one dramatic moment. It happens slowly, structurally, invisibly. This war is now entering that second phase. The question is no longer whether this conflict will affect the global economy. It already has. The question is which nations are structurally positioned to absorb that shock and which nations are not. And the answer to that question depends entirely on one thing. How exposed is your country to the fractures this war is creating? The more exposed in terms of energy imports, food supply chains, financial interconnection, and military dependence, the more painful this phase will be. The less exposed, the more likely your country finds a way through. Let me walk you through every major player with that framework in mind. On the surface, this conflict looks like it has settled into a stalemate. The front lines have not moved dramatically in months. Both sides are exhausted. Western support for Ukraine has become politically complicated. Russian losses have been severe. Surely, the logic goes, some kind of negotiated settlement is close, but underneath that surface, something very different is happening. Russia has now shifted approximately 40% of its entire national budget toward military spending. That is a wartime economy, not a nation preparing to negotiate, a nation preparing to outlast. Russia's leadership has made a structural calculation that Western political will to fund this war will collapse before Russia's ability to sustain it does. If Russia is right about that, then the consequences chain outward fast. If Ukraine loses significant territory, the entire post-1945 European security architecture, the principle that borders cannot be changed by force, collapses with it. That does not just affect Ukraine. It affects every smaller nation that has relied on that principle for its security for the past 80 years. For ordinary Ukrainian families, this means something very specific. Another winter of infrastructure attacks, energy shortages, and economic contraction with no clear end in sight. For ordinary European families, it means continued pressure on defense budgets, energy prices, and economic growth at a moment when their own economies are already under severe stress. Now let us look at the other major front of this war, the Middle East. On the surface, the conflict between Israel and Iran looks like a regional military confrontation. strikes and counterstrikes, proxies and missiles. A dangerous but contained Middle Eastern war. But underneath that surface, this conflict is something far more significant. It is a direct challenge to the energy architecture that has powered the global economy for the past 50 years. Here is a number that explains everything. Approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. 20%, and that narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula is the single most important energy choke point on Earth, and it sits directly inside the blast radius of this conflict. Iran has made explicit threats to close the strait if it faces an existential military threat. If that happens, even temporarily, even partially, the consequences chain outward with devastating speed. Oil prices spike. Shipping costs explode. Every nation that imports energy through that corridor faces an immediate economic shock. For ordinary families in Asia, Europe, and Africa, families who have nothing to do with this conflict, this means higher fuel prices, higher food prices, higher electricity bills, because energy prices do not stay in the Middle East. They travel, they arrive at your petrol station, your supermarket, your heating bill. Now let us look at the nations most exposed to that energy shock. On the surface, China looks powerful. The world's second largest economy, a military expanding rapidly, global influence growing across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. China's leadership projects calm confidence. But underneath that surface, China is facing an economic vulnerability in this new phase of the war that most Western analysts are seriously underestimating. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy needs from the Gulf region. 40%. That is a massive structural exposure to exactly the supply corridor this conflict is threatening. And China's entire economic model, the model that made it wealthy over the past 30 to 40 years, is built on importing cheap energy and exporting manufactured goods. Cheap energy in, manufactured goods out. That is the engine. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. China knew this model was fragile. For 2 decades, Chinese leadership has been trying to transition toward a consumer-based domestic economy and a technology-driven innovation economy. But that transition has not worked the way they hoped. Chinese household savings rates remain extremely high, meaning consumers are holding money rather than spending it. Growth in domestic consumption has been far slower than planned. The bet on artificial intelligence faces its own problem. AI infrastructure, the data centers, the training runs, the compute clusters, consumes enormous amounts of energy, the very resource that is now under threat. So China's old model is being squeezed from the outside, and its new model is not ready. For ordinary Chinese families, this means continued economic uncertainty, rising unemployment among young people, which already exceeded 20% in urban areas at recent peaks, and a government under growing internal pressure to deliver the economic growth it has promised. Now let us look at the nation that is best positioned to navigate this new phase. America's situation in this global reorientation is genuinely different from almost every other major economy, and it is worth understanding why. The Western Hemisphere is extraordinarily resource-rich. America has oil, natural gas, agricultural land, fresh water, timber, and critical minerals. Essentially everything a modern economy needs to function largely within its own borders, or those of its immediate neighbors. The Western Hemisphere is close to energy self-sufficient in a way that Europe and Asia simply are not. This means that regardless of what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, regardless of how this Middle Eastern conflict unfolds, America is not dependent on that supply corridor for its basic economic survival. That is a structural advantage of enormous significance. But, and this is a serious but, America is sitting on $39 trillion in debt. $39 trillion. And the mechanism that makes that debt sustainable, the petrodollar system, where Gulf oil is priced in US dollars, creating permanent global demand for American currency, is under pressure from this very conflict. If the Gulf states, under sustained military and economic pressure, begin moving away from dollar-denominated oil trade, the recycling mechanism that funds American borrowing weakens. This is not an immediate crisis, but it is a structural risk that is growing, not shrinking, as this war continues. For ordinary American families, the near-term impact is manageable, but the long-term fiscal position of the United States depends on decisions that are being shaped right now in the middle of this conflict. Now let us turn to the region that is least discussed and most at risk. Most geopolitical coverage of this war ignores Africa almost entirely. That is a serious analytical failure, because Africa is where the humanitarian consequences of this new phase will be most severe. Many African nations are deeply dependent on food and energy imports. Those imports flow through global supply chains, the same supply chains that this war is fracturing. Fertilizer prices, which collapsed agricultural capacity across parts of Africa during the 2022 energy crisis, are rising again. Shipping costs are elevated. Diesel prices, which determine whether food can be transported from farms to markets, are climbing. The bombs fall in the Middle East, the hunger arise in Africa. That is not a metaphor. It is a documented pattern from every major energy disruption of the past 50 years. Food security experts are already issuing warnings about several sub-Saharan nations. This is not a distant possibility. It is a present trajectory, and it is receiving almost none of the international attention it deserves. For ordinary African families, this new phase of the war is not abstract geopolitics. It is the price of the food on their table. Now let us look at two more nations caught in the middle of this reorientation. India was, until very recently, one of the most exciting economic stories in the world. The fastest growing large economy on earth. A manufacturing hub that global businesses were investing in as an alternative to China, a nation with a young population, a growing middle class, and enormous long-term potential. But India imports approximately 60% of its oil from the Gulf region. 60%. That is one of the highest dependency ratios of any major emerging economy. And that dependency is now a serious strategic vulnerability. Here is the consequence chain. If Gulf energy becomes more expensive or less reliable, India's manufacturing costs rise. If manufacturing costs rise, the foreign investment that was flowing in, the investment that was supposed to power India's economic transformation, slows or reverses. If that investment slows, the millions of young Indians entering the workforce each year face a jobs market that cannot absorb them. India's economic potential is not destroyed by this, but it is being seriously complicated at exactly the moment India was ready to step onto the global stage. So how India navigates this energy challenge over the next 3 to 5 years will determine whether it fulfills its potential or whether this war delays that ambition by a decade. Pakistan is in a genuinely dangerous position. Its economy was already under severe stress before this conflict escalated. Energy shortages, currency instability, and an IMF dependency that limits policy options. The new phase of this war is arriving at the worst possible moment for Pakistan's ordinary families. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because what this war is doing and what this new phase is triggering goes far deeper than individual country stories. Every story we just covered is actually the same story seen from a different angle. For the past 50 years, the global economy operated on a simple, elegant, and deeply fragile arrangement. The West consumed, the East produced. Gulf energy powered the production of American financial and military architecture, secured the whole system. It worked. It created extraordinary prosperity. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But it only worked as long as 4 things remained true simultaneously: cheap Gulf energy, reliable global shipping, American military protection of those shipping routes, and stable financial flows denominated in US dollars. This war is now putting pressure on all 4 of those pillars at the same time. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. This is not a temporary disruption after which the old arrangement returns. This is the beginning of a structural transition to a new global economic order, an order where regional self-sufficiency matters more than global interdependence, where energy independence is a strategic necessity, not just an environmental goal, where the nations that can produce their own food, fuel their own economies, and defend their own supply chains will shape the next century, and the nations that cannot will be subordinate to those that can. The nations that understand this transition now and begin adapting their economic strategies to it will be the winners of the next 30 years. The nations that keep waiting for the old order to return will fall behind in ways that will take generations to correct. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion of this entire analysis, because you might expect me to say that Iran is the biggest loser of this new phase. Iran's infrastructure has been struck. Its economy is under extreme sanctions pressure. Its proxies are being degraded. Surely Iran suffers most. But actually, no. The entity that stands to lose most from this new phase of the war is not Iran. It is the global financial system that was built on the assumption of perpetual stability, and the nations most deeply integrated into that system without sufficient buffers of their own. Think about what the past decade of globalization actually created. It created extreme efficiency, supply chains that span the entire planet with zero slack, zero redundancy, zero buffer. Because buffers cost money and markets reward efficiency, just-in-time manufacturing, single-source dependencies, financial systems so interconnected that a shock in one corner of the world travels everywhere. Within hours, that system is extraordinarily productive in periods of stability and extraordinarily fragile in periods of disruption. It is like a high-performance racing car, magnificent on a smooth track, catastrophic on a broken road. This war is the broken road, and the nations that built their entire economies on maximum integration into that system without developing parallel capacities for self-sufficiency are discovering that their efficiency was actually a form of structural fragility. The nations that will navigate this best are not necessarily the richest. They are the ones that maintained enough redundancy, enough domestic production capacity, enough energy independence, and enough political cohesion to adapt when the global system stopped working the way it was supposed to. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. And it is a form of wisdom that most of the world's economic planning in the past 30 years has systematically undervalued. So let us just recap what we covered today. Ukraine and Russia are locked into a war of attrition that is reshaping European security and draining Western political will. There is no quick exit, and the consequences of how it ends will echo for decades. The Iran-Israel conflict is directly threatening the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which 20% of the world's oil flows. Even partial disruption of that corridor sends economic shockwaves across every continent. China, despite its apparent strength, is the economy least prepared to adapt to expensive energy. Its economic model depends on cheap, imported Gulf energy, and that model is now under structural threat. America, with its vast Western Hemisphere resource base, is best positioned to navigate this transition. But its $39 trillion debt and petrodollar dependence are serious long-term risks that this war is accelerating. Africa faces the most severe humanitarian risk. Food supply chains and fertilizer economics are already under pressure, and the consequences for the world's most vulnerable populations are being dramatically underreported. India's extraordinary economic potential is being complicated at precisely the wrong moment, with 60% of its energy dependent on the Gulf region. And the deeper story, the one that ties all of these together, is that this war is accelerating a transition away from the globalized, interdependent economic order of the past 50 years toward a more regionalized, self-sufficient world. The nations that adapt to that transition fastest will shape what comes next. This war is not just a military conflict. It is the trigger for the most fundamental restructuring of the global economic order in generations. The question is not whether this restructuring is coming. It is already here. The question is whether your country and whether you personally are ready for it. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening in the world, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explain geopolitics and global economics in simple English, so that ordinary people have access to the same quality of analysis that used to be reserved for policy rooms and financial institutions. Subscribing is the single best way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. And I have a specific question for you in the comments. Which country do you think will emerge as the biggest economic winner from this new phase of the war? America, because of its resource wealth, or a nation you think most analysts are underestimating? Tell me below. I read every comment. I will see you next time.